This is the Italian Citizenship Podcast, hosted by Marco Permunian and Rafael Di Furia.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Italian Citizenship Podcast, presented by Italiancitizenshipassistance.com. Of course, we are back at it again with Italian attorney Marco Permunian. How are you doing today?
Good, how are you?
I am doing great, thank you. And in today's episode, we wanted to talk a little bit about the Italian judicial system and how it works, and relate this a little bit towards decision 17161 from June 15th, and get into a little bit of the reason why that decision isn't binding and why that decision maybe shouldn't be of concern to some individuals who were previously concerned, and why some decisions, if it's made one time over, might not be binding to another, that the case law doesn't necessarily work the same. So Marco, can you just give us a brief overview of kind of where this is coming from and how the Italian judicial system works?
Of course, we're talking about the recent decision of the Italian Supreme Court in Italian Corte di Cassazione, which got quite some attention in the news and in the community of people who were looking into applying for Italian citizenship by descent, or who are in the process of applying for Italian citizenship by descent. And let's maybe take a step back and just give an overview of what we're talking about here. We're talking about a decision, again, which was rendered by the Supreme Court in a 1948 case. And for people who don't know what it is, a 1948 case is a case that needs to be presented in an Italian court by somebody who is seeking Italian citizenship by descent, because there is a female in the Italian line who gave birth to her child before January of 1948, which is when the Italian Constitution came into effect. In other words, if you have a female in your Italian line who gave birth to her child before that date, you have to petition the court in order to get citizenship if you have no other available Italian lines, but if you do, then you can use those lines to apply maybe through the consulate. Of course, people who don't have a female in their Italian line, or people who have a female who gave birth to her child after 1948, they can apply for citizenship, say, the traditional way, through the Italian consulate or through an Italian municipality. But if your only available line includes a female who gave birth prior to 1948, then your only way to pursue Italian citizenship is via the court system. And we've released a lot of videos about 1948 cases that people can watch to understand, how it works, how the case needs to be presented. But here we're talking about a very specific subcategory of 1948 cases, meaning a 1948 case involving an Italian ancestor who was born in Italy and who became naturalized while his or her child was underage, so under the age of 21, if we're talking about a naturalization that occurred prior to 1975, because prior to 1975, the adult age was 21 in Italy. And if the ancestor became naturalized, and if the child was under 21 when the parent became naturalized, again, we've talked about this previously, according to a minor group of judges within the Court of Rome, within the Civil Court of Rome, that was going to be a potential problem. I will say that again, some judges within the Civil Court of Rome were considering this to be a problem, whereas the majority of the judges within the Court of Rome were approving these cases without any problems. But then what happened is that the law changed in 2022, and these citizenship cases are no longer to be filed in the Civil Court of Rome when the plaintiff resides abroad, but they are to be filed in the local regional court, basically that cover the city where the Italian ancestor who was born in Italy was from or was born. And we have recorded an episode about this change in the law, and so people who are interested in understanding more about this change in the law, they can watch that episode. But the change in the law was very positive because we started to file cases across Italy in the various civil courts that we have in Italy. So we have literally filed cases everywhere in Italy, and all of the cases presented this issue were being approved as of this moment in time, we have had no rejections, meaning that the local judges, they've always ruled favorably in cases where the ancestor who was born in Italy became naturalized while their child was a minor. So what happened on June the 15th of 2023, what happened is that the Supreme Court ruled in a case that presented this issue in a negative way. So the Supreme Court stated that the fact that the ancestor became naturalized when their child was a minor was indeed an issue. And by the way, this case was probably initiated, so it was presented the first time a few years ago because, it was probably denied by the Civil Court of Rome. It was denied again by the Court of Appeal of Rome. And then it went to the Supreme Court and it was denied again. And all of these rulings take time. So, of course, the case was presented by a different attorney, not us, so we don't have all the details of the case. But the Supreme Court ruled negatively, despite the fact that my firm has presented numerous appeals before the Italian Appeal Court of Rome for those cases that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, which were denied by that minority of judges within the Court of Rome, and we got all favorable decisions, at least as of this moment in time. But nonetheless, this different attorney, they brought this case before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rendered this decision. And people, after this decision, they started to panic a little bit, understandably. But the purpose of this video, and as I said in the other video that we released very recently about this Supreme Court decision, is to explain why people shouldn't be concerned, because this Supreme Court decision is not legally binding. And now we will get into the details of why it's not binding and for who it's not binding, which is basically for anyone. And we will explain how it works from a legal standpoint in Italy. So before I explain why this Supreme Court's decision is not legally binding, let me explain that, or let me clarify, I should say, that it was taken by a judge within the Supreme Court. So when I say Supreme Court, in this specific case, I mean a judge within the Supreme Court. And it's not unusual in Italy that the Supreme Court itself, meaning a different judge, takes a different decision in a different moment in time. So it's perfectly possible that another similar case will be brought by another plaintiff before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will take a different decision. Of course, that's only possible if a lower civil court denies the case, and again, the Court of Appeal denies the claim again, and then the case is brought before the Supreme Court, because that's the prerequisite for a case to be brought before the Supreme Court. But say that happens, that the Supreme Court could take a decision in the opposite direction. So that's a point to clarify that this Supreme Court decision was taken by a judge within the Supreme Court and not by the whole Supreme Court, as some may think. And also, it's important to clarify that my firm got recently 2 decisions from the local regional courts for cases that presented this issue dated after the Supreme Court decision, so after June the 15th, and they were positive. So that, again, evidence, again, of the fact that even the lower courts, they're not bound by this decision. So this decision is not binding, not even for the lower courts, as evidenced by the fact that we got 2 positive decisions very recently, one last week and one the week before. And now let's get to the reason why this Supreme Court's decision is not legally binding for any other courts in Italy, including the lowest courts, so the civil courts where people are presenting these 1948 cases. And the reason is just the Italian judicial system is built that way. So it's not like the US judicial system or other judicial systems where the legal precedent is binding. So a case law, a precedent, is affecting immediately people's lives. And in Italy, it's something different. So the judicial system is built in a way where the Supreme Court takes a decision, and that decision does carry some authority, but as evidenced by the recent rulings that I just mentioned from the local courts that we got, is not binding for anybody. Because the only situation in Italy that is really binding for all the citizens and everybody who is involved in the Italian legal system is a law. So only if a law made by the government, made by the parliament, comes into effect, and that's affecting people's lives immediately, that's legally binding. But a case law, a precedent is not. So a lot of people ask me, then what's the purpose of having a Supreme Court? And like I said before, another decision could be taken by the Supreme Court by a different judge, and it could be an opposite decision from the one that we just saw. So what happens when within the Supreme Court, judges disagree on a specific matter? So what would happen in the case that the different judge within the Supreme Court would take an opposite decision? When there are several opposite decisions taken by several judges within the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court would gather, and all the judges together would examine the matter and take a decision, which would be a final decision. And that final decision is called Cassazione a sezioni unite. So it means that all the judges within the Italian Supreme Court have gathered. They have examined the matter and they have taken a decision. Now, not even that decision is binding, but it would make no sense for the lower courts, so for the civil courts or for the Court of Appeals, to rule in a different way, because they would know at that point that if the case was to be appealed and brought by the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court would take the same decision that they took when all the judges gathered together to settle the matter. So we're not there yet. That has not happened in the case of the ancestor who became naturalized while the child was a minor. It may or may not have happened. And this decision, which was taken by a single judge within the Supreme Court, like I said before, is not binding for the reasons that I just explained.
Marco, that is really such an amazing explanation of how things work. And thank you for being so thorough about it. And just to be able to kind of clarify and to maybe see if I'm understanding correctly, as I did in the previous episode that we spoke about this topic, in hopes that maybe this will also clarify things for anybody who is watching. So, in short, for anybody who is going through this 1948 case where they would have it taken to the court, and then the court would give a negative reply, but then you go to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal would also give a negative reply. If it would also be taken to the Supreme Court, and it's just a singular judge, then theoretically things could be overturned. But then if it's brought to even the top tip level, and it's brought into this united full session with all of the judges, theoretically then it's still not binding, but most judges would still hold in that direction. So just to make sure that, in short, this is roughly what you were talking about, correct?
That is correct.
That's really interesting. And you have me curious about something, that in the situation where maybe you would have one judge from the Supreme Court versus the whole group coming together, that even if the whole group of judges came together, that it might not still be binding. How would that even work? So,
like I said, it would still not be binding, which shows how in the Italian judicial system, no legal precedent is binding, not even if it's taken by all the judges in the Supreme Court. But like I said, in that situation, it will make no sense for a lower court to rule in a different way. But we've had situations in the Italian history where the judges within the Supreme Court changed over the years. That's natural. Judges change. And over, for example, a 20 years span of time, it could be that all the judges together have taken one decision. So they have decided that a matter should be decided in a certain way. And then 10 years after, 20 years after, a different group of judges, meaning the Supreme Court, with the judges all gathered together, but with different judges because the judges have changed over time, they've taken a different decision. So we have had situations where in the Italian history, even the Supreme Court, with all the judges gathered together, they have taken opposite decisions over a 10 or 20 years or more span of time. And of course, in that specific moment in time, it makes no sense for a lower court to take a different decision from the decision taken by all the judges gathered together. But in a different moment in time, it will make sense for lower courts to make a different decision based on what's the interpretation of that specific matter is given by these judges of the Supreme Court all gathered together.
Interesting. So it's really the Supreme Court challenging previous rulings rather than lower courts challenging those rulings is what you're talking about.
Exactly. So say, for example, in 6 months from now, all the judges within the Supreme Court, they gather because a case is brought before the Supreme Court, which may or may not happen, but they gather, and they decide that a person who was a minor when their parent became naturalized, that is not a problem. So they decide that, their descendants qualify for Italian citizenship, that the naturalization of the ancestor while the child was a minor is not a problem. People can apply without issues. But then in 10 years from now or 15 years from now, when the judges have changed, because, like I said before, judges change over time. So we could have a Supreme Court made of different judges in 10 years from now, and they gather again and they decide the same matter in an opposite way. So they could say in 10 years from now, we don't agree anymore with what was decided by the Supreme Court 10 years ago. Now we say that is, in fact, a problem and people don't qualify for citizenship anymore. But then it could be that after 10 more years, these judges, they gather again, different judges, because the Supreme Court will be made of different judges in 20 or 30 years from now, and they take again a different opposite decision. So what the Supreme Court says in a specific moment in time only affects really the decisions of the lower courts in that specific moment in time, and it will make no sense for the lower courts to rule in a different way from what the Supreme Court has decided, again, with the judges all united together, because the lower court would know that then the case would be potentially appealed and be brought before the Supreme Court, which would take, of course, the decision regarding that specific matter that they have already taken with the judges all gathered together.
Marco, this is all really absolutely fascinating. And just for clarity's sake, just because we have gone into some theoretical areas about what things could look like or they might not look like, while going into how the Italian system functions, which I have to say I'm absolutely fascinated by. It's something that I really enjoy learning more about. The system as it works today, can you just clarify very quickly how things are, who's allowed to, who is not allowed to, but then also to bring it back to some potential theoretical instances which may or may not occur? Does any of this have the ability to affect citizenship by descent through either municipalities or through consulates?
So to recap, now people who have a 1948 case, they have to present their cases in the local regional courts, and if their ancestor either never became naturalized or became naturalized when their child was already an adult, they have nothing to worry about. Also, people who do have an ancestor who became naturalized while their child was a minor, but have a different ancestor who never naturalized or who naturalized when their child was already an adult, they have also nothing to worry about. People who, on the other hand, have an ancestor who naturalized while their child was a minor, they also have nothing to worry about, because the Supreme Court decision that was recently rendered is not binding for the lower court, as evidenced by the successful cases that we just got very recently after the Supreme Court's decision was taken. Of course, the Supreme Court decision does carry some authority, so people who have a case involving an ancestor who was naturalized when their child was a minor do have to take into consideration some risks, some minor risks, due to the fact that the Italian Supreme Court's decision does carry some authority. So every judge in the Italian legal system, including the lower courts, I should say, operate as their own entities. So they have the ability to take any decision they want, regardless of the Supreme Court decision, or they could take into consideration the Supreme Court decision. But as of this moment in time, as I say to all my clients, there's nothing to worry about. I'm encouraging everyone to bring their cases forward because we're having success. And regarding your last question, the Supreme Court decision cannot affect the cases of people who are going through consulates or municipalities, because the Italian judicial system is completely separate from the public administration in Italy, which includes consulates, and municipalities. So people who have a case involving an ancestor who was naturalized when their child was a minor, but are going through the consulates or municipalities, they have nothing to worry about because the judicial system is separate. So that decision that was taken by the Supreme Court cannot affect their cases.
Marco, again, thank you so much for going into all of these details and for all of these clarifications and explaining how all of this works. And of course, if anybody is needing help to get their Italian citizenship, how can they get in contact with you and your team?
People can contact us through our website, Italiancitizenshipassistance.com, or give us a call. Our numbers on the website.
Absolutely fantastic. And of course, if you're interested in more information like this about getting your Italian citizenship, make sure that you're subscribed to this YouTube channel as well as the audio only podcast. But if you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, you're also automatically subscribed to the Italian Real Estate Podcast. And of course, if you're interested in more information about life abroad, living abroad, or living abroad as a dual citizen expat, be sure to come over to my YouTube channel and audio only podcast. You can search for Not Your Average Globetrotter on YouTube, Google, or your favorite podcast player of choice. Of course, we have been here with Italian attorney Marco Permunian from Italiancitizenship.com. I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and we will see you all next time. Later.
Thank you.